Welcome back. I went through all 32 NFL teams to figure exactly how each coach affects your fantasy football team. Today's episode, the Houston Texans. So take a seat, class is in session. Before we get started, we need to see exactly what coaching changes were made first. This has been a full-on coaching shift in which we're seeing a more defensive focus between DeMeco Ryans and Matt Burke. But the guy who particularly matters a little bit more to us is Bobby Slowick, and he is their new offensive coordinator. And the only thing that we're really seeing is that he's an offensive passing game specialist. This team didn't lose too much in the offseason, but I think actually filled their gaps really, really well. And the gaps that I'm particularly very fascinated in is the offensive line more than anything. Like, they really put a big emphasis on that and making sure it was better. Same thing on the defensive side of the ball. They really wanted to fix that run game. And I'm a big fan of Juice, the center that they picked up towards the end of the second round. So now that we've laid the foundation for exactly how the Houston Texans have addressed this offseason, we can start to identify exactly how it impacts our fantasy football teams. But before we do that, we need to check with the guys upstairs to see exactly how they have the Houston Texans projected to go about this season so we can give our knowledge a little bit more structure. What we're going to notice about the public is that they're very pessimistic on the Houston Texans this year, and it's pretty easy to see why. I mean, brand new things all around, and I know everyone's going to be harping on CJ Stroud's downfall because of the S2 score. I initially was as well, but then I started looking into it a little bit more and became far more optimistic about this upside for this team. This team is currently projected to only get 6 to 7 wins. They're not theoretically going to make the playoffs. In theory, they should be at the very bottom of the barrel of their division. But this division is easy outside of the Jags. Let's make that very clear. And I would much rather have CJ Stroud as my starting quarterback over Anthony Richardson and Ryan Tannehill at this particular second in time. And I'll get a reason why I like him more than Tannehill specifically once we get to the Tennessee Titans video. And that's more based on how I see that team restructuring and so on. And before I get all this Anthony Richardson hate, just stay for that video. It's literally coming tomorrow. And I'll explain to you as someone who's watched a lot of Florida football as to why you should not be nearly as optimistic off the bat with someone like Anthony Richardson as most people are. The reason I'm more than anything optimistic about this team is because their offensive line play. And specifically, when you have a very strong offensive line, you typically win the game 67% of the time. And my theory is that you want the best overall offensive line because that typically leads to the best overall running back play. Now, do I have the statistics to particularly back this up at the second time? No. But that makes a lot of sense to me, and I think it's why we saw Jeff Wilson particularly perform extremely well with the 49ers last year. Yes, they now have Christian McCaffrey, but seriously, think about that production and the overall gaps that they open up for him, and if you want to put another case and scenario for it, look at the run blocking scheme that they had on Atlanta that they're now putting Bijan behind. But we can also look at another instance where there was bad offensive line play, which led to bad running efficiency. The Indianapolis Colts with Jonathan Taylor last year. Sorry to all those guys who took him at the 101. I don't mean to bring back those bad memories. But considering kind of this basis of information, I actually think they have a very good chance at finishing at number 2 in this division and surprising a lot of people. And as we get a little bit further into this, I think you're going to become a lot more optimistic about this team just like I am. So now that we've got a really strong understanding of exactly how the Houston Texans address this offseason, we can start to identify exactly how Bobby Slowick is going to affect our fantasy football team. I'm going to let you know right off the bat, we don't have a lot of numbers to really go off of here. So looking at the QB1 here, we have CJ Stroud. Going off the chart here, we really don't have a lot of information to go off of. This is a very new role for Bobby Slowick, so we could honestly see a big step back, but I'm pretty much a CJ Stroud truther. And let me give you some reasons why I'm very optimistic about CJ Stroud. Your offensive line realistically is going to be great. Your division is extremely easy outside of the Jags. People are severely undervaluing you because of an S2 score, which is supposed to A, be confidential, but B, is not the biggest determinant of your overall success in the NFL. People are seeing Brock Purdy scoring the highest, I believe, in that category, and are just like, he is God. I don't know if I'm fully a Brock Purdy truther yet, but I do think he's very good. But that's not what this video is about. Last point that I'm going to kind of get it to here is that, like, we're all forgetting exactly what he did against that Georgia team. Yes, they lost that game, but dude, that is the best defense in college football. Like, not the best defense in college football history, but like that at this point in time is the best defense in college football. And when you look at the people who were actually drafted from Georgia, it's not guys on the offensive side that are going high. It's guys on the defensive side that are going high. And you have a kid that basically took it all on his back and said, screw it, I'm a god. Doing. Like, that's super optimistic to me. And I'll dive into a little bit more of the metrics here because we really don't have too much to go about in terms of the actual like prospectus off the charts here. So I'm just going to give my base reasoning so we can kind of get my thought process a little bit more. The players that he models himself off of are Deshaun Watson and it was Michael Vick. Deshaun Watson is a consistent QB5 in fantasy. Michael Vick was an absolute monster in fantasy. We've seen what those guys can do with their arm, and we've seen the rushing upside that they can do. We also know that Ohio State basically inhibits your ability to run the ball in that offense as a quarterback. And the reason I say that is look at what Justin Fields did at Ohio State on the rushing upside compared to what he's doing in the NFL on the rushing upside. That makes me believe there's a little bit more room for CJ Stroud's overall rushing upside. But let's kind of debunk this S2 theory a little bit. Yes, I understand that means your decision making is poor in theory, but I don't think that nearly applies as much when you have a very strong base. And what exactly does that mean and why is it important? Having a strong base means that you're ready to throw the ball at essentially any point, meaning you're already pointing from one point to the next, to the next, to the next. You're making your reads, but you're already set up to throw the ball. The issue with a lot of quarterbacks when they come to the league is they don't always have the best base, i.e. Anthony Richardson. And same thing with Will Levis. To me, honestly, I think a Dak Prescott comp here is pretty good. So it's like when you have a strong base, you're already set up and you're looking at your decision to make the right one or whatever. You're already prepped. You're not having to like really recalibrate in any facet. You're kind of ready to just let the ball fly. Whereas people who have bad bases typically make worse throws because it's like they're not set to make that throw for the theoretically proper decision. So although he may have a bad S2 score, I think he's going to really impress a lot of people because he's already going to be set to throw exactly where he actually wants to each time. Whereas I think we're going to see a lot of these younger quarterbacks struggle in that department. Now, he's been getting some angry writing comps that is similar to Marshawn Lynch. I'm not saying he's the next Marshawn. I'm not going to go that far. But I do think we're going to see a really nice upside out of somebody like him this year. Now, we do not have the best overall running back total to really look at here from a coaching perspective, but it's theoretically in an uptrend, right? I think its safe floor is realistically around 16 to 17 fantasy point per game. Honestly, I would really be a little bit more bullish and kind of go towards 18 fantasy points per game if you really want to be crazy. But I think he's undervalued in a lot of facets. I think people are looking at the back half season of the production are like, oh my God, he's bad, blah, blah, blah. Bro, that's what happens when you have a negative game script. Like, you need a better game script for somebody, and what exactly does that mean? So we can dive into that a little bit before you like hear like positive game. He kind of goes back and forth with all these terms all the time, blah, 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 blah. One, follow my madness, that is my brain. Two, for running back, a positive game script is basically winning the game. Meaning that you're wanting to run down the clock more, meaning that you're theoretically giving him the ball more to run the ball out. And with somebody like Dameon Pierce, that makes a lot of sense. Like, if the Texans theoretically are going to be taking a massive step forward against what the kind of consensus thought process is, then Dameon Pierce is probably going to be at the forefront of that. And that's typically where we also see a big leap in overall running back production as well. And what I like to find is really strong offensive lines. And if you look at what they did in this offseason, I really think they built themselves a really strong line. And to me, that's where I think we're going to see someone like Dameon Pierce really thrive. I know the hype is all going to be behind Bryce Young. I'm a very big fan of him. I really think CJ Stroud has a much better shot at getting Rookie of the Year in theory. But moving over to the running back two, and that is Devin Singletary. Continuing that overall thesis of like, we don't really have too much data about Bobby Slow, so we're going to kind of speed through these a little bit with more kind of theory more than anything. I think a 9 to 10 fantasy point per game average makes a lot of sense here. Not going to beat around the bush too much. I think he's going to perform well, and if for some reason Dameon Pierce falls out of the picture, Devin Singletary is a nice fit. Move over to the wide receiver one, and that is going to be Nico Collins. He's got a much better RAS score than people are giving him credit for. We don't have a true understanding of exactly where the wide receivers are actually going to perform in the system, but if in theory he's being told to study Julio Jones from that 2016 Falcons offense, I think that a 16 fantasy point per game floor is a very nice estimate to go off of, which means he is very undervalued. And he seems to be really the only receiver that they're super optimistic about at this particular second in time right out the gate. Moving over to the wide receiver two, in theory, it's going to be Robert Woods, but I think there's a higher chance it's going to end up potentially being like John Mechie or Tank Dell by the end of the season. The Texans have a lot of receivers in that draft room. I think it's 13 at the second in time. Not everyone's going to say, so I can't really sit here and be like, they're going to keep these people. I think it's more of a toss-up between John Mechie and Robert Woods. I really can't put you towards either which direction, but that's kind of my guesstimate. I do think there's definitely some upside here, but it's highly questionable. I think a 12 to 13 fantasy point per game average for whoever lands here is very nice. And if you want to go with my long shot, we're going to move over to the wide receiver three, and that is going to be Tank Dell. And the reason I'm going with Tank Dell here is going to be a little bit more of this kind of theory and elaborated progress and yada, yada, yada. But like, he's valid in every sense of the term as a wide receiver, and I don't think he's going to be drawing the primary wide receiver one coverage. I think that's going to end up being Nico Collins as we go throughout this year. And the kid was a baller in college. And everything that I'm reading in off-season reports about him is just awesome. It's not awesome in the sense that you're like, oh my God, he's catching a lot of passes? No, it's more along the sense of he's the guy showing everyone around. Like, he was also the guy that CJ Stroud specifically asked for when they were like, well, you're not going to get JSN, so who else do you want to play with? And he said Tank Dell. And he was the guy that CJ Stroud was vouched for and was like, that's the guy who I want to be my wide receiver if you guys aren't going to get me JSN. And that's what they went out and did. And so he's just called him up and he's like, hey, what do you think about like playing together essentially? And he's like, I'd love to, blah, blah, blah. Like, I love your game, yada, yada, yada. And he doesn't get to leave Houston. In fact, he and CJ Stroud are hanging out every single day. They're showing each other around, yada, yada, yada. I think his connection with Stephon Diggs is particularly interesting. Perhaps it was like through some sort of family connection that I don't know about, or like a receiver camp or workshop or whatever, yada, yada, yada. But like, it was very interesting when Matthew Berry had him on his show and was like, who's the most famous person in your phone? And he goes, Stephon Diggs. Like, no hesitation whatsoever. Matthew Berry was like, oh, you don't have to like call him or whatever, but like it almost seemed like an insult, like he didn't think he would actually, like Stephon Diggs would pick up, or like Matthew Berry didn't think he would like pick up for whatever reason. But the fact that they're constantly like commenting and like reposting each other on like Instagram is kind of interesting to me. Like, it's like, why are you having that level of interaction rate with somebody that you theoretically aren't that close with? If I had to take a shot on any receiver in that third round, it is going to be Tank, the guy who led the nation in receiving touchdown and receiving yards last year. He doesn't have to leave Houston. CJ Stroud vouched for him. He's absolute boys with Stephon Diggs. And he is also one of Steve Smith Sr.'s verified receivers. Yes, he is undersized, but I think when it comes towards the end of the season, he's going to be a guy everybody wants on their fantasy roster. Move over to the tight end position, and that is Dalton Schultz. This is where we theoretically have a high basis floor for a very low sample size, and that's at potentially like 13 to 14 fantasy points per game. And based on the production that we saw from Dalton Schultz in Dallas last year, makes sense. And really, he's the only kind of veteran receiver that I think is actually really going to stick in this offense. So if you want like a safe target guy that you can more than likely consistently count on here, I'd go with Dalton Schultz. As you can kind of garner, I'm very optimistic about this Houston Texans team, and I think you should be too. Do I look at all these positions and see a screaming amount of value? Yes. I think a big thing that you're going to want in fantasy this year is a lot of Texans pieces in your overall fantasy teams. Now, depending upon who exactly that is going to be, I could not full on tell you, but if I had to take some shots at guys that I think are really going to be impactful this year, I think that CJ Stroud could potentially be Rookie of the Year / Offensive Rookie of the Year. I think D'Amico Ryans as Coach of the Year makes a lot of sense. Heck, John Mechie 3 as a comeback player of the year could be really cool. I think that's actually kind of an interesting storyline. I think Nico Collins is a lot underrated. Like, every piece about this offense is just screaming value, 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 value. Like, I don't know. I'm big on the Texans this year. If you like this video and this overall series, make sure to drop a like and subscribe. We're dropping a video on the Indianapolis Colts tomorrow, and I'm going to basically tell you why you should be very wary of somebody like Anthony Richardson in fantasy football this year. But I'm also going to show you the upside pieces to it as well. As always, peace.